This is my first video podcast. I'm still working out the kinks, so thanks for your patience. I'm here today with Micheline Maynard, who is interviewing me to celebrate over 300 episodes of Tip of the Tongue. Mickey is a journalist, and she publishes Culinary Woman newsletter on Substack. Listen, it's on Tip of the Tongue. Welcome to Tip of the Tongue, a podcast on the Nitty Grits Network, where we explore the intersection of food and drink and museums. This is Liz Williams.
Liz, thank you so much for having me as a guest on Tip of the Tongue. And I wanted to congratulate you because you recently retired from the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, but you were the least retired person I know. So I'd love to hear what led you to choose to retire at this point, and then also what you're doing. Get us up to speed on what you're doing.
I retired about 2 years ago, and I really did it because I think there's that tendency of an organization that has a long-term founder that stays with it to be totally dependent on the founder. And if something happens to the founder as you age or drop dead or whatever happens, then the organization can't recover and the organization dies because you're not available anymore. And I didn't want that to happen. I put too much energy into making the museum something that was important and sustainable. And so I had to pass it on. And then you have to get out of the way. So you have to be gone. And so that's what I did because the other people they shouldn't have to defer to you all the time out of some sort of crazy loyalty or whatever. So that's why
Yeah.
I retired. And it also allows me to do some other things that I wanted to do that I didn't have time to do. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm doing more writing and I'm actually in the rewriting stage of a biography of Marcel Bienvenu, who is a really important figure in the history of the food of New Orleans, the modern history of the food of New Orleans and South Louisiana. And so I'm just running around.
Yeah. But the podcast has really blossomed. You're up to over 300 episodes, is that
Oh
right?
yeah, I found it. I
Amazing.
found once I decided to do it, I kept putting off starting it. And I started it right before COVID. It was at the time that everyone was talking about this thing happening in China. I kept putting it off because I thought this is going to be relentless. I'm going to have to do it every week. I'm going to have to be consistent. And I didn't want that. But then finally, I
Yeah.
decided you really have to do it. And so it's turned out to be really fun. And
Mhm.
also, I've learned a little bit about editing, audio editing, and now I'm going to try video editing.
Yeah.
And it's also allowed me to have access to a lot of people that I didn't know, but that I wanted to talk to. So
Yeah.
that has been really fun.
There's really interesting people out there. You're on Substack, I'm on Substack. I find that once the publicist for authors find out you have an outlet, that they approach you. So
Yes.
I get pitches on upcoming cookbooks. I get pitches on people who are opening restaurants and new products. And would you like samples? And honestly, you could drink and eat for a year with all the free stuff that people want to
That's
send.
true.
But I was just interested, are there some authors that you've really enjoyed having on? Or are there a couple people that jump out at you from your conversations?
There are several people that I found it really fascinating to talk to. Krishnendu Ray, I don't know if you know him, but he is at NYU
Mhm.
and he wrote an op-ed or some kind of essay in the Bombay Times. And it was in response to the food editor of the Washington Post, who wrote a really ugly review of Indian food in general, and basically
Oh,
said that Indian food was muddy and it was all the same, it all tasted the same. And of course, I don't know what that was based on. It certainly isn't it the Indian food I've eaten. But anyway, Chris wrote an article in the Bombay Times that was in response to what had appeared in the Washington Post. And I interviewed him later and he was outraged and it was really great. And it's so possible now to talk to people all over the world. He was in India when I spoke to him,
that's
and
amazing.
it was great to be able to do that. I've also spoken to people in where I've had two people on the podcast because a book might have been co-authored, and one was in Australia and one was in New Zealand, and it was
Wow.
called Gastro Fashion. And they talked
Okay.
it was a book, and they talked about food influencing fashion and the relationship to the body that food has, which is so much like wearing clothing. And that was really interesting because I would never have been able to interview them without having some kind of electronic way to talk to everyone at the same time. So anyway, those have been really fascinating. And there's always somebody interesting to talk to.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you recently had on the author of a book about the rules of dining.
Yes.
And I listened to that podcast and I've actually read the book.
Uh-huh.
And I found myself disagreeing with him on a number of his points, but it's a valid point of view. He worked in restaurants and he was writing from the owner slash front of the house point
Right.
of view.
Right.
But and then he said specifically, I'm not about to tell servers how to do their job. I'm here to tell consumers how to behave. And I thought that was very interesting because I feel like the rules, first of all, I don't like rules anyway, but I have also felt that the rules are so different because dining is so different. There's so
Right.
many ways we can dine now versus just walking, making a reservation, walking in a restaurant, sitting down, and somebody brings you a menu.
Right. And it's also true that the food in more casual restaurants has really come up in terms of the flavors and the presentation. And so you can not necessarily have to go to spend hundreds of dollars per person for food and still have a really good experience. I think that I think that it's really difficult if you know you're going to be spending $400 or $500 a person at a meal to be dissatisfied because it's such a big drop of money all at once in one place in maybe a 3 hour at most experience, and then to have a server not it's not necessarily the server's fault if things don't go properly. The meal could be really spoiled in the kitchen, and the poor server is the person that you're facing when you're dissatisfied, and the server probably doesn't have the power to change that. But I also think that you have the right as the consumer to have something to satisfy you.
Right.
It's
Yeah, and I think in this day and age, things are starting to divide, and I've written about this on in Culinary Woman about the income divide that's taking place,
fine.
where the top 0.1%, not just the 1%,
Right.
is who a lot of these places, these high-end places are aimed at. And then for the rest of us, like that middle type of restaurant is the one that's getting squeezed.
Right.
And down at the lower end, there's all kinds of great cheap eats out
Yes.
there.
Yes.
And you can go out and find them. And so here in the Detroit area where I live, we have a huge Arab American population. And the Arab American dining here ranges from fine dining, but just down to drop-in dining and food trucks. And so you can get a lot of food for $20 or less, or you can pay $100 if you want to. But we have Arab American food courts, which I think is a really cool way to sample different things. So
Right.
that's one of the things that's developed. I don't know if it's been since the pandemic or even before that, that the more egalitarian choices in dining versus the white tablecloth dining.
I think that those kind of middle restaurants always existed, or even the lower level restaurants, but they were not something that you visited in the same
Right, we
frequency.
didn't eat out when I was a kid. I
Yeah.
mean, when my parents traveled, we got to go to McDonald's, got to. That was a huge deal for us. My mother cooked all our food or we dined out on vacation.
Yes.
So
I mean,
I know you cook a lot now anyway. I don't, did you eat out very much when you were young?
no, no, almost never. And for us to go to McDonald's or Burger King was like a big deal. And in the
Mhm.
very beginning, I remember when those places opened, and they would sometimes have 2-for-1 hamburgers and things. And my mother would go and she would buy, say, 4 hamburgers and freeze them. And we still
Right.
ate them at home
Oh,
because
wow.
she
Yeah,
would,
White Castle does that. Yeah.
yeah.
We can
And
buy them in the grocery store, but
but she would
really,
just go to Burger King and buy because they were having some kind of a special. But
yeah.
she would make the side, whatever side she wanted to make sure you had a vegetable, make sure it was still a rounded meal, because that was one of the things that she found really wrong about those places is that you couldn't have a complete meal. So then
So the
she,
one place we had a pizza place called Casanova, which my dad called cats and snowballs, which we kids thought was very funny. And then there were some fine dining-ish restaurants of the time, and people belonged to private clubs. So there are
oh,
country clubs and city clubs here in the Ann Arbor area. And later on, my mother was president of the Ann Arbor City Club. It was called the Women's City Club, and they have a dining room and they have a pub and a dining room. And so if we were going to go somewhere, it would be someplace like that or eat at home. My mother was a really good cook and I like to cook and I know you love to cook. So would you say that you eat the majority of your meals that you've cooked or dine at home?
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that I use going to a restaurant for meetings.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Hmm.
otherwise I would probably never go.
Yeah, I'm getting less and less. I'm going less and less
Yeah.
to restaurants just to eat. I have a couple of places that I like to go that I will go by myself, but I
Uh-huh.
was going a couple of times a week before the pandemic, and now I go maybe once every 2 weeks. I might get something at a place and take it home, but I don't go and sit down the way that I used to.
And I find that I'm eating less.
Uh-huh.
I'm
Yeah.
just not as hungry as I used to be. I'm
Right.
sure it's age or whatever. And so it's expensive to go out to
Yeah.
eat all
Yeah.
the time.
Oh,
And so I feel like I'm wasting food. So even
yeah.
if I take it home, because some things don't reheat well and it just isn't always satisfactory to bring it home. And like we have a Thai restaurant here, and the Thai food there is very good. But if
Uh-huh.
you get something like pad Thai or something that is very noodly, you have
Yeah.
this huge plate. It's full
Mhm.
of noodles,
Yeah.
and if you just eat out, if you get it with shrimp or something, if you eat out the shrimp and a few vegetables that are on top, and then you have this enormous plate of pasta, it just doesn't live very long. You can't bring it home and make it into something else easily.
Yeah, I keep that in mind when I'm ordering in restaurants. 'Cause if I'll get just basic food like a piece of salmon
Uh-huh.
and salad or whatever, I can divide that and take home because they give you these huge
Oh yeah,
slabs of
it's way
food.
too much. Yeah.
So I'll divide it in half and take at least take the salmon home or something like that. Yeah. So I know you're doing so many things, but I'd love to talk about the archive that you're involved in and maybe talk a little bit about the kind of donations that you've been getting and what you're looking for.
Okay. What happened was SOFAB started a little library the Southern Food and Beverage Museum started a little library when we began. And that was going to be an internal library so that we would have a reference material on hand. And then we lost a good bit of that because of Hurricane Katrina,
Yeah.
which destroyed a lot of the books. And I have to tell you, there is nothing salvageable when you see a book that's been underwater for 3 weeks. It is pulp. It's totally disintegrated. You
Mhm.
can't salvage it. And so, in that feeling of in the country, because it was that first big disaster that like took over the whole city. And of course, since then, we've had multiple disasters of
New
such
disasters.
consequence,
Yeah.
but that
Yeah.
was the first one. And so the whole country rallied around us as a city, and everybody would get in touch and say, what can we do? And
Mhm.
so I put out the word that the thing that would be wonderful if would be if people could send us books for our library because we had essentially lost the library. And so people started. And then when organizations decided to have their meetings in New Orleans as a way to support New Orleans as the city got back on its feet, they would call me and say, what can we do? And I would say, if everyone would bring 2 or 3 books in their suitcase, and then we'll come with boxes and box them up, and we'd get hundreds of books at a time.
Yeah.
And usually people were giving us books that they had deaccessioned, so to speak, from their own libraries. But that meant that we had this broad, it wasn't just new books, it was books that went back. And
Yeah.
and then once people started to do that, we realized had the makings of a public library, a library that should be used by the public and not just by us. And
Yeah.
so that's how the research center really got started. Then I had a conversation with Paul Friedman he's a history professor at Yale, and he said one of the most wonderful things about studying history is when you can physically participate in the research and
Mhm.
not just read about it intellectually. So, for example, what he meant was if you read someone's journal, a journal from 300 years ago or something, and they
Right.
talk about lifting a cauldron out of the hot fireplace or hearth or whatever, and it's heavy, and are off balance leaning in, and it sloshes on you, and you get burned, but you can't drop it because you lose everything. You can read about that, but if you actually pick up the cauldron that's full of whatever, just even if you just put water in it and you see how heavy it is, then you have a muscle experience of that thing that's being talked about, and you understand it better than just having read about it. And so that's how we decided to do a research center where we have ephemera, where we have actual artifacts. So if you want to study beer, you can not only study beer and the history of beer in books and things and how to make beer, but you can touch old bottles of that beer
Yeah.
had come in and see how it was capped, and
Yeah.
then look at the cans that have developed and see how the cans have changed over time. So it's a real research center and not just a library anymore.
One of the things that's always interested me is menus.
Oh
And
yes.
I know
Uh-huh.
you've been asking people on your Substack to send
Right.
you menus.
Right.
And I
Yes.
can attest to how useful they are because I was in the Chicago History Museum and I understood that they had a menu collection. And so I looked it up and they said, give us a day. And I came back and they came out with this cart full of binders of menus from all the way back to the 1910s up
Uh-huh.
to about the 60s. And I've been writing a novel that I don't know if it'll ever come to anything, but it's set in the 1920s in Chicago, and I was very interested in what restaurants were like in Chicago in the 20s, so 100 years ago. So I started to sort them by types of cuisine. And first of all, the tea room. So just like a normal place where, your grandmother, your great grandmother might go and eat, they would have 60 or 70 different kinds of items. So they would
Mhm.
have all the pastries and all the biscuits, and then they'd have tea, and then they'd have little sandwiches, and they might have a hot dish. But these menus went on and on. And then I got to the Italian restaurants, and I started to notice that everybody had green noodles. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what green noodles were. And I was asking, is this pesto? Is it spinach? And apparently they would tint the pasta with spinach or kale or whatever, and it would come out green and put Parmesan cheese or whatever on it. And people like to eat their green noodles. And then I looked at the 1940s because I was looking at World War II, and all these menus were saying things like, we don't have sugar. Don't ask for sugar with your coffee. Don't expect a refill on your coffee. Here's the section where we make the bread without flour. We have whole wheat or whatever we have spelled. And you could definitely see the progression of history through all of these menus. And then
Right.
once you got up to the 50s and 60s when, there's a lot of wealth in Chicago, then their French cuisine was huge in Chicago, and it got fancier and fancier. So you trace the city's progression by the menus from the restaurants. We mostly went to East to Cape Cod. My dad was from Massachusetts, or we went to Chicago or Toronto, and then we did go to Disneyland in California a couple of times. And those were the times when we were allowed to eat out. My dad worked for American Airlines, and so we traveled on those passes that
Oh,
the
wow.
employees
Uh-huh.
got, and you didn't pick how. So if we went to California, you might go Detroit to LA, but coming back, we went LA, Dallas, New York, because it was just where the free space was available on the
Right.
airplane. And I remember we had a 3 hour layover at LaGuardia, and my parents had a rule that we could only get one drink with our meal, so chocolate milk or Coke or whatever. And because we had a 3 hour layover, they get let us get two in
Oh,
that.
wow.
And so I went to LaGuardia years and years later because I remembered sitting on a terrace like upstairs overlooking the airfield, and there isn't a restaurant there anymore. And I said to them, "What's up there?" And they said, "Oh, we just use it for storage."
Oh, wow.
I have this vivid memory of A, getting to have two drinks, and B, watching the airplanes come in from that restaurant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's interesting because kids now, they eat out all the time and they get delivery food all the time. And it's a mix of dining out and cooking at home.
So did your mother work outside of the home?
Not until I was in junior high school. So my brother and I were only in our grade school for 1 year together because he was older than I was. And then the year before he went to college, my mother and father must have talked about it and said, if we're going to pay for college, we need more income. So she went back to work at Eastern Michigan University, which is a medium-sized university next to Ann Arbor. And she had worked as a professional woman in Chicago before her marriage, and she had a lot of skills, but back then they weren't valued. So
Right.
she did get hired, and then my father died a year later, and young and of heart trouble. But thankfully, she had already re-entered the workplace because there's a lot of women who lost their spouses at the time who were then forced to go to work and didn't
Right.
have background. It didn't, didn't have the ability to maneuver within an office setting.
Mm.
I was a latchkey child for became a latchkey child,
Right.
literally had a like a little knitted cord with the house key on it. And I hear a lot of Gen Xers talk about being latchkey kids, and
Yes.
we were that generation that our mothers did work outside the home.
In my case, my father worked in the office of my grandfather. My
Mhm.
grandfather had started a freight forwarding business because of
Okay.
the
Oh,
port of New
interesting.
Orleans.
Yeah.
And so mostly they did exports. And after my father was working there, and my grandfather wanted to retire,
Okay.
my father bought him out. He paid him every
Mhm.
month as a kind of retirement out
Yeah.
of the business.
Yeah.
And then my mother went to work there because now
Mhm.
it was a business that they didn't want to have a second employee, so they had my mother go in. And so
Sure.
I was in maybe the ninth grade or something
Mhm.
like that when that happened.
Yeah.
And I would come home and make dinner.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
I was home for when my brother got dropped off at the bus stop.
Mhm.
And so we were latchkey children, but I was in the ninth grade. I wasn't exactly going to run around on my bike and do stuff. I was going to probably, if I didn't have to
Just
make dinner, I probably would have talked on the phone to somebody.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The mothers who worked when I was in grade school were there were a couple of ladies who were teachers. So, like the fourth grade teacher, and I think one of the other teachers had kids in the school. And
Uh-huh.
then there were ladies just like that, that they had family businesses and they worked as the secretary or the bookkeeper, usually the accountant in the business. And then, or they had worked as the bookkeeper, and then the husbands were doing well enough that they could stay home. And staying home is in quotation marks because the ladies in my mother's circle were very busy with volunteer work, club work, and things like
Mhm.
that. And they were out a lot. And so I
Yeah,
was a lot latchkey kid just because my mom was out at a club meeting or something, not
right,
because she was
right,
working. But
right, right.
yeah, and then I remember a wave in about high school of mothers that then rejoined the workforce. And now I think it's more common to have two parents working than not.
And I think that contributes to some of the picking up takeout and delivery and whatever, because if you're in a job that's very demanding, you might have to work late or
Right. Yeah.
there's just no dinner.
Yeah.
And I think that if you don't have somebody that you've cooked with, like your mother, or it could be your
Mhm.
father, whoever was the cook
Yeah,
in the
sure.
house, you don't necessarily know how to fend for yourself. And I think that's an important skill that we shouldn't lose. I think cooking is a really important life skill.
I cook. I was complaining to my brother that I feel like I'm running the dishwasher every other day, and he's, it's because you're cooking. It's not because the dishwasher's small or anything like that. But I, I wanted to share this one story. So I have a friend, Sherry, who is a home organizer, and she and I were working together yesterday, and we took everything, every single thing out of the fridge and disposed of the aged things. And now I can actually see into my fridge and I have all this inspiration
Oh,
for
that's great.
what I'm going to cook next. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. I want to thank you for participating with us and being the interlocutor today. It's been a lot of fun, and this is going to be the very first podcast I actually use the video for, so we'll see how that works out.
Talk at the tip of the tongue of video pod.
That's right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Tip of the Tongue, a podcast about food, drink, and culture. You can go to Tip of the Tongue on Substack to get show notes or other news, or you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. This is Liz Williams. Thanks for listening.